Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for this invitation, and I have very happy memories of visits to Frankfurt in the past, and I hope one day be able to meet you all in person again and talk to you face to face. As Olga suggested, I am in fact writing a book about anthropology museums. It's almost finished. It has to be handed to the publisher in December, and it's called The Museum of Other People. And the final section, which I'm still struggling with at the moment, just about finished, is of course about the crisis that is facing these museums. A crisis which I sometimes think might be terminal. And there are three obvious challenges which everybody talks about at the moment. The one is demands for restitution. The second is the demand that what we now have supposed to call source communities are somehow must be engaged in every exhibition which touches on their heritage. And third, particularly in the United States, a new phenomenon, the emergence of what I call identity museums, which are in a way, the opposite, or at least at the opposite pole of the Museum of Other People. But I have come to the conclusion that there's a fourth challenge, which is even more difficult. And this is from another direction entirely. It's the vogue for rebranding ethnographic museums as museums of art. That is, of course, of a particular kind of art. So three huge, grandiose, extremely expensive museum spaces were recently unveiled in Paris, Berlin, and New York. And they were all devoted, largely or entirely, to a particular kind of art. Let's call it for the moment primitive art. So in 2000, President Jacques Chirac of France directed the Louvre to mount a temporary exhibit of what he called primitive art. And in June 2006, he created the Musée du Quai Branly, which appropriated the collection of the Museum of Oceanic and African Art, and which had once been, in fact, called the Permanent Colonial Museum. And it also appropriated the ethnographic holdings of the Musée de l'Homme and rebranded them as art. In Berlin, the Humboldt Forum was unveiled at last in December 2020. And it seems to me, although it's not exactly an art museum, it tends very strongly in that direction. And its holdings come very much like the Quai Branly from Berlin's Ethnographic Museum and the Museum of Asian Art. And finally, the Metropolitan Museum in New York City is undertaking at a cost of $70 million a radical overhaul of the Michael Rockefeller Wing, which was built in 1982 to exhibit the Rockefeller family's collection of African, Oceanian, and pre-Columbian American art. Now, despite this huge building boom, it's not at all clear what kind of art is going to fill these huge new museum galleries. There's not even, I think this is symptomatic, there's not even agreement about what on earth we're going to call this kind of art. The Quai Branly, Chirac originally floated the term des arts premiers, the original kind of art. But the Quai Branly now talks about non-European art. So does the Humboldt Forum. And the director of the Metropolitan Museum has recently invoked what he calls the non-European traditions that gave birth to modernism. So the people who ran the Met, the Quai Branly, and the Humboldt Forum can't really explain what kind of art they're promoting, but they agree on one big thing. This stuff is the business of art historians, not anthropologists. Wole Soyinka, the Nobel Prize-winning Nigerian writer, is delighted by this development. Let me quote, "No wonder it was a deep, euphoric exhalation and sense of vindication that emerged from the throat at long last when I visited the Musée du Quai Branly after that prodigious institution embarked on its new policy of taking African art away from anthropology. At the old Musée de l'Homme, the arts of a continent had been press-ganged by habit into a cohabitation that did not remotely reflect the value of African creativity, an aesthetic denial that merely catered to the determined agenda of exclusionism and artistic downgrading." Now, I imagine still, according to anthropologists, the masks, the statues, the jewelry, the musical instruments, the ceramics, the baskets, the decorated furniture, the elaborate boats, sometimes entire monuments that started to be collected in faraway places and shipped home more than a century ago by naval expeditions, by traders and colonial officers, were not art. They were the stuff of science, of ethnography. Art, anthropologists always say, is a Western category. The distinction between fine art and decorative art is an 18th century invention in Europe. In Europe, the Romantics at the end of the 19th century turned art into a sort of religious cult. But anthropologists tend to argue, I think, that these Western fashions have nothing to do with the productions of the African craft guilds or the Polynesian carpenters and joiners who produced materials which we have in our museums. Okay, where did this cult of primitive art come from? Full-blown primitivism emerged in Paris in 1904 or 1905 or 1906. There's a lot of argument about that. And it was invented by post-impressionist artists who came to value, as a matter of fact, the ethnographic museum, the Paris Ethnographic Museum, Trocadero, as a gallery of primitive art. And they began to make their own collections. So this is Pablo Picasso, photographed in 1905 in his studio in Montmartre. And at the same period, the same year, in fact, Picasso claimed that he had an epiphany in the Musée d'Ethnographie in Paris. When I went to the Trocadero, it was disgusting. The flea market, the smell. I was alone. I wanted to get away, but I didn't leave. I stayed. I understood something very important. Something was happening to me, wasn't it? The masks weren't like any other kinds of culture or sculpture, not at all. They were magical things. I understood what the purpose of the sculptures were. The purpose of the sculptures was for the Negroes. All the fetishes were used for the same thing. They were weapons to help people stop people being dominated by spirits, to become independent. Tools. If we give form to the spirits, we become independent of them. The spirits, the unconscious, which wasn't yet much spoken of then, emotion, it's the same thing. I understood why I was a painter. All alone in that awful museum, the masks, the red Indian dolls, the dusty mannequin. Les Demozel De Avignon must have come to me that day, but not at all because of the forms, but because it was my first canvas of exorcism. Yes, absolutely. Now, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which was of course painted in 1907, features 5 stylized, angular, nude prostitutes, 2 of whom have African masks for faces. There's one theory which might interest you particularly, which is that they might have been inspired by illustrations from a book by Frobenius on masks in African secret societies. But Picasso always denied that the demoiselle borrowed from African models. He insisted there is nothing of art nègre in the Demoiselles d'Avignon. Of course, at more or less the same time, or actually in many ways overlapping, German expressionist painters also took up primitivism. And in fact, they began to exhibit together with their French counterparts. So also including sometimes in these exhibitions, African or Oceanic masks or sculptures. So the Fauves and the Cubists exhibited together with the Die Brücke in Dresden in September 1908. Works by Picasso were shown along with African sculptures in Berlin's Neue Galerie in December 1913 and in Dresden in January 1914. And if you look at the gallery statements at the time, they're beginning to already to attach modernist labels to African and Oceanic works. So a Dogon sculpture might be identified as Cubist, a piece from the Sepik as expressionist or surrealist, a Samoan work as minimalist. And of course, as I'm sure you know, Nolde and Max Pechstein made a pilgrimage at this time to German colonies in the South Seas. But the very epitome of the primitive artists in rebellion against bourgeois Europe was, of course, Paul Gurgan. Although Gurgan was almost unknown until his death in May 1903, 227 of his paintings and carvings were included in the Salon d'Automne in 1906, where they were shown alongside the latest works of Cézanne, Derain, Vendôme, and Matisse. But of course, it's obvious, I think, as much as his art, it was de Gauguin's legend that entranced the post-impressionists. Here was a married stockbroker who gave it all up to live a primitive life and make primitive art. And of course, Gauguin also had a theory, or at least some ideas, about the wickedness of civilization and the superiority of what he considered to be the primitive condition. So he wrote to his daughter, "You will always find nourishing milk in the primitive arts, but I doubt you'll find it in the arts of ripe civilization." Now, these post-impressionist and expressionist artists began to talk up the masks and what they called fetishes of exotic people, who, by the way, just happened to live in France's new colonies in Africa and the Pacific. And they praised them especially because the museums excluded them. So they were therefore, in a way, kinsfolk of the post-impressionists who were also excluded from the official salons. So Picasso said, "When I discovered l'art nègre, it was a way for me to oppose what was called beauty in the museums." So the post-impressionists marched under two banners, twin banners, primitivism and modernism. And fashionable galleries in Paris and Berlin exhibited carvings from Africa and Oceania alongside the post-impressionist paintings and sculptures. Well, if it was art, perhaps it shouldn't be excluded from the art museums. In 1912, Guillaume Apollinaire called, I quote, "for a grand museum of exotic art, which will be to this art what the Louvre is to European art." And his was not a lone voice. In 1920, the Bulletin de la Vie Artistique posed the question, will arts from remote places be admitted into the Louvre? Artists and writers who responded were overwhelmingly in favor. But what were they talking about? From the start, it was very difficult even to find a name for these exotic arts and crafts. So you have a critic writing also in the Bulletin de la Vie Artistique in 1923, and he complains, "We lack a convenient word to designate the art of faraway countries." And he goes on, "The Museum of Decorative Art calls them indigenous. Do we have to accept this designation? Should we say exotic? But this term is taken on a pejorative sense. It makes one think of attractions that lack seriousness, belly dancing and opium dens, l'art nègre, again a scandalous word. One must excuse oneself for using it. But there is no equivalent. The art of faraway countries, in ordinary talk, it's insufferable to use such a long phrase. Indigenous is too loose. exotic, too louche. Who can rescue us from this embarrassment? And of course, the question asked then 100 years ago remains just as relevant today. Okay, we can stop the Picasso slide, thank you. Primitive art became the default designation in Europe and the United States. Nelson Rockefeller opened a private museum of primitive art in Manhattan in 1954. He had thought of calling it indigenous art, but in November 1956, he was writing to a donor, one thing has been preoccupying me is this name, indigenous. It doesn't seem to convey anything to anybody except a few professionals. So he switched to primitive. He explained, like Gothic long ago and modern more recently, it was once a term of disapproval. Like them, it has become a term of historical description and praise. But what exactly was meant by primitive art? Robert Goldwater, a young American historian of art who I'll talk about a little bit later, had a riddle. What is primitive art? Answer, the stuff that isn't in the Metropolitan Museum. But that didn't work for very long because soon it was in the Met. Okay, if you have a look at the slide now, Philippe Dagen, who is a very well-known French art historian, columnist in Le Monde, general intellectual, has recently published a 2-volume history, Primitivism. He argues that the artists born around 1880, like Braque, Derain, Picasso, needed to distinguish themselves from the Impressionists. And so, partly to épater la bourgeoisie, they came out as wild men, fauves, primitives. And paradoxically, the artifacts from Africa and Oceania that they were strewn casually around their studios signaled hypermodernity. It simultaneously conveyed contempt for the Western tradition. According to Dagen, the masks and carvings that Picasso collected were signifiers of a rupture. And Picasso himself said, the African sculptures that hang around my studios are more witnesses than models. To what do they bear witness? According to Dagen, they affirmed that Picasso was freeing himself from the lesson of European Beaux-Arts. Now, of course, earlier generations of artists and connoisseurs and collectors and museums had had their flings with exotic non-European crafts. So in the late 18th century, there was a great fashion for chinoiserie. In the early 19th century, as France began its colonial occupation of Algeria and Tunisia, Islamic carpets and paintings of ladies and eunuchs in harems came into fashion. There was even a French Orientalist Painters Society. After Japan opened up to foreign trade in 1858, there was Japonisme. But these modes were mostly to do with the decorative arts, and in any case, as Dagen remarks, primitive and exotic are not synonyms. Primitivism had a particular force. It gloried in what was imagined to be the polar opposite of an equally abstract, equally generalized, idealized civilization. Now, the post-impressionists took it for granted that African and Oceanian carvings were inspired by religious or magical ideas. And they called very disparate objects fetishes. For the rest, their ideas about primitivism and civilization were not really very informed or coherent. Later, historians of art would attempt to pin down formal affinities between post-impressionist and what they called primitive artworks, but these are also elusive. Picasso himself insisted that he saw and understood African masks very differently from Matisse or Braque or Derain. He said he understood that they were really magical or religious icons, but his colleagues regarded them as just like any other kind of sculpture. In fact, Picasso says Braque wasn't even frightened of them. Exorcism didn't interest him. He doesn't understand these things at all. He isn't superstitious. The American writer, a friend of all these painters, Gertrude Stein, put it another way. She said the effect of this African art on Matisse and Picasso was entirely different. Matisse was affected more in his imagination than in his vision. Picasso more in his vision than his imagination. In any case, Picasso began to be very defensive, a bit of a trickster later in discussions of primitive art, l'art nègre, and so on. In 1920, a short-lived avant-garde review of the arts, Action, quizzed artists about their feelings for l'art nègre. And Picasso responded, l'art nègre connaît pas. Everybody, he said, everybody always talks about the influence of l'art nègre on me. This is an interview with André Malraux in 1937. What can I do? We all loved fetishes. Of course, not all the young experimental European artists were converted to primitivism. So Max Beckmann, for example, complains in 1912, unfortunately, all kinds of primitive races have impressed some of the young German painters, and nothing seems more important to them than Bushman painting and Aztec sculpture. But let's be honest, let's admit we are not Negroes or Christians of the early Middle Ages. Are those crude and shabby figures we now see in the exhibits rarely an expression of the complicated spirit of modern times? Primitivism took a more coherent form in the 1920s. The Surrealists were, of course, by now the new pacemakers in the Parisian avant-garde, and they venerated fetishes, as they call them, from Africa and Oceania, and they became fans of African-American music and dance. In the 1920s, the Surrealist Commissar, André Breton, developed a potent mix of conceptions about instinct, the unconscious, sexuality, and the primitive, all good, and civilization, putrid, rotten, false. For reasons that I haven't really been able to really understand, some surrealists now began to pretend that oceanic art was even better, more important than African art. In 1929, a special issue of Variété, a Belgian surrealist magazine, published a surrealist map of the world. And at the center of this world was a gigantic Polynesia. Africa and India were tiny. Alaska and Labrador loomed over diminished North America. A miniaturized Europe, smaller than Easter Island, was dominated by Germany. And hanging on the very edge of this tiny Europe was Paris. Now, with the surrealists, you also get a new element, which is a racial, very explicit racial marking of what they called primitive art. And this term, this French term, l'art nègre, referred in a vague sort of way to any sort of music or arts and crafts from the South Sea or Africa, perhaps even including Native America. Maureen Murphy, a student of Philippe Dagen, has invented the wonderful term for it, AO art, Afrique, Amérique, Océanie. But in Paris in the 1920s, the most popular living practitioners of l'art nègre were African Americans. So the poet and ethnographer Michel Leiris recalled that in jazz, quote, I'm quoting here, came the first appearance of the Black Americans, the manifestation and myth of Black Edens, which will lead me to Africa and beyond Africa to ethnography. So this enthusiasm, it was real enough, and yet there's a distinct element of anti-racist racism there. And in fact, Apollinaire punned about a new cult, which he called le melanophilie or melanomanie. But as for the French ethnographers, they were ambivalent about this cult of l'art nègre. Paul Rivet, the director of the Museum of Ethnography at Trocadero, accepted that his museum needed to cater for the enthusiasm, the vogue of primitive art, but he set limits on all this aestheticism. He insisted that the Trocadero was a museum of ethnography. It was, he said, about the stuff of everyday life. And his solution was to erect a barrier between art and artifacts. And he allowed his deputy, Georges-Henri Rivière, to arrange a hall of treasures in which select artifacts would be presented as masterpieces of art. But eventually, the ethnographers revolted even against this concession. So Michel Leiris recalls, it didn't happen at once, but it was already visible in the very austere installations that were made in 1937. Rivière decided to get rid of the wooden cases and install metal ones in order to make them look more sober and austere. And then there was anti-aestheticism. The ethnographers didn't want to hear any more talk of art nègre. It had become too fashionable. Besides, anthropology couldn't be reduced to what was called art nègre or to the study of exotic arts. We were against both the explorers who wanted, above all, to romanticize and glorify relations with the people under study, and the aesthetic view of these people's aesthetic material products. Marcel Griol, a leading Africanist ethnographer, ridiculed connoisseurs who questioned the authenticity of a baoula drum because the figure carved on it is holding a rifle. In 1930, he wrote in the surrealist journal magazine Document, ethnography, it is quite tiresome to have to keep repeating this, is interested in the beautiful and the ugly, in the European sense of these absurd words. It has, however, a tendency to be suspicious of the beautiful, which is rather often a rare, that is monstrous, occurrence in a civilization. Ethnography is suspicious too of itself, for it is a white science, stained with prejudices, and it will not refuse aesthetic value to an object because it is up to date or mass produced. And the Hall of Treasures in the Trocadero Museum was shut in 1936. So it wasn't only the anthropologists who were in reaction against the aestheticism. The surrealists were also in reaction against the attempts of the ethnographers to treat these works, which they regarded as works of art, in a different way. So André Breton said that those ethnographers, they know everything about the objects except what matters most, the fusion of the heart and the spirit in the work. And he pleaded that something of the enigmatic should not be disturbed. The last veil should not be lifted. Well, it wasn't, how am I doing for time, by the way? I didn't have a clock in front of me. Anybody? Can anybody tell me? No?
40 minutes.
Oh, I've spoken 40 minutes? Or I have 40 minutes?
Oh, you have 40 minutes to go if you want.
Excellent. Right. Now, it wasn't just a matter for artists and ethnographers. There were the dealers and the buyers, the plutocrats. Dealers pounced as soon as the avant-garde artists showed an interest in primitivism. I think that I have found a moment at which this fusion can be dated. November 1912, Frank Berthier Aviland, a wealthy French-American painter and dealer, gave Picasso an African mask in exchange for one of his drawings. So I think this is a symbolic mark of a new market that included classical African and post-impressionist art on an equal footing. After World War I, American collectors beat a path to Paris to buy modernist paintings and primitivist carvings and statues. Nelson Rockefeller was a regular visitor to the gallery of Hélène Leloup on the Boulevard Raspail. And she recalled, oh, she said, these people knew nothing. They were wild for novelties, for French wine, French couture, and why not d'art nègre? And she noted that there was such demand that she had to get the help of African entrepreneurs who delivered truckloads of artifacts to warehouses in Paris. And French dealers in primitive art soon set up shop in New York. And in 1923, the Brooklyn Museum became the first US institution to present African carvings and sculpture as art. The exhibition was called Primitive Negro Art, chiefly from the Belgian Congo. Chiefly from the Belgian Congo, this was a publicity coup for King Leopold's Congo, which was getting very bad publicity at the time. In 1929, which of course was the year of the stock market crash, but also the year in which the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, opened in New York, a cosmopolitan Austrian count, René de Arnoncourt, arrived in New York from Mexico City, where he had been dealing in Central American art. And he would soon be installed as Nelson Rockefeller's private coach and agent. So Manhattan, Paris, Brussels, Mexico City network of dealers was soon in place. It would be crucial to the success of both what was called modern art and what was called primitive art in the United States. So by the 1930s, there was a vogue in Paris and in Manhattan for primitivism. In 1933, there was an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York with modernist art matched with pre-Columbian masterpieces from Central America. And the title of this exhibition is very telling: American Sources of Modern Art, Aztec, Mayan, Incan. So the scarcely disguised subtext was that American modernists were the equals of those Europeans, and moreover, that these Americans found inspiration in American, not African or Oceanian primitives. MoMA followed up in 1935 with a hugely popular exhibition of what they called African Negro art. In 1938, Robert Goldwater, whom I mentioned earlier, young American historian of art, published his doctoral dissertation, Primitivism in Modern Art. This is a very important intervention. Goldwater didn't buy into the myth that post-impressionist artists, including Gurgan, learned much from African or Oceanic models. He argued that exotic masks may turn up in their paintings, but I quote, "There's little that is not allusion and suggestion rather than immediate borrowing." According to Goldwater, the reception of primitive art was important because it widened our concept of what art is, he said. It's made us realize the many shapes that art can assume. Nevertheless, he went on, both the social purposes and the aesthetic achievement of primitive art, its forms and functions, are widely different from those of modern art. He said, I quote, this is very important, although modern artists admired primitive art, they neither copied it nor, despite what they themselves sometimes thought, ever really had the same ends in view. So Goldwater made a distinction between what he called primitivism, a modern Western ideology, and what he called the primitive. And the primitive, he said, was the business of anthropologists. And as for art historians, it is, he says, it is primitivism in which we are interested. But he admitted this does presuppose some knowledge of some kind of the primitive. And he had to admit that neither primitivism nor primitive were easy to define. Of course, at that time, some anthropologists, notably Franz Boas, were very skeptical about the very idea of a primitive condition of primitive people. So Goldwater ended up by saying our definition of primitivism must in consequence be discursive. In other words, it could be described but not defined. Anyway, primitivism in modern art became a minor classic of art history, and it was certainly uncannily timely. It presaged a decisive shift in the market for both primitive and modern art from Paris to New York. A year after Goldwater made this aesthetic case for primitivism and against anthropology, Claude Lévi-Strauss arrived in New York as a refugee from German-occupied France. He had escaped on one of the last ships carrying refugees. André Breton was a fellow passenger. Lévi-Strauss was alone. His wife refused to join him. In his early 30s, an exile, an anthropologist without formal training or qualifications, his country occupied, his parents in hiding from the Vichy authorities. And yet he was oddly happy in America. He became fluent in English and Americanized his name, presenting himself as Claude L. Strauss. This is because a colleague had told him that his real name would make students laugh because of the blue jeans. He got to know Franz Boas and developed collegial relations with Robert Loewy and Alfred Kroeber, but his close friends were drawn from the exiled French surrealists. They shared his curiosity about unconscious thought processes and his passion for exotic art, and he admired their aristocratic dandyism. He considered taking lodgings near the Boasian base at Columbia University, but he decided rather to rent an apartment in Greenwich Village, where the surrealists were concentrated. Lévi-Strauss said that the village reminded him of Montparnasse, and there he recalled one could still lodge, as in Paris in the time of Balzac, in a duplex of 2 or 3 floors with a back garden. Lévi-Strauss, of course, was the son of an artist, and he had always been an habitué of the Parisian flea markets. And in New York, he began to scour antique shops for African and American masks and sculptures, together with André Breton, Max Ernst, and Marcel Duchamp. Lévi-Strauss recalls, we shared among ourselves, according to the funds available, the pieces for sale at New York's antique dealers. It was a time when these works did not arouse any interest, which in itself seems like a myth today. In 1951, I had to sell my collection. In 1943, in an essay for a little magazine that Breton had started, Lévi-Strauss described, I quote, a magic place that may be seen daily from 10 to 5 o'clock at the American Museum of Natural History. It is the vast ground floor gallery devoted to the Indians of the Pacific Northwest coast, an area extending from Alaska to British Columbia. This was, of course, the famous collection that Boas himself had installed. Lévi-Strauss, of course, was fascinated by Boas's comparative approach. But Boas took a historical point of view. And for Lévi-Strauss, what was important was something very different. The Northwest coast had been occupied by Europeans only since the late 18th century. Yet far from being stuck in some primordial rut, Lévi-Strauss claimed that the art of the region was characterized by a creative ferment. I quote, this century and a half saw this is Lévi-Strauss, saw the birth and flowering of not 1, but 10 different forms. This unceasing renewal, this inventive assuredness that guarantees success wherever it is applied, the scorn for the beaten track, brings about ever new improvisations which infallibly lead to dazzling results. To get any idea of them, our times had to await the exceptional destiny of a Picasso. And where Boas traced historical relationships, Lévi-Strauss analyzed the relationships between the masks of different tribal groups in the region as a series of ordered structural transformations. They develop by way of a creative dialogue between neighbors, each insisting on its own variants of common themes. Lévi-Strauss recalled that he struggled to understand the local stylistic variations, get a handle on them, until he said, I realized that, as is the case with myths, masks too cannot be interpreted in and by themselves as separate objects. Looked upon from the semantic point of view, a myth acquires sense only if it is returned to its transformation set. Similarly, one type of mask, considered only from the plastic point of view, echoes other types whose lines and colors it transforms while it assumes its own individuality. But Lévi-Strauss didn't treat these Northwest Coast materials only from the point of view of a structuralist anthropology. He regarded them in themselves as works of high art. In 1943, he echoed Apollinaire's prophecy. Surely it will not be long before we see the collections from this part of the world moved from ethnographic to fine arts museums to take their just place amidst the antiquities of Egypt and Persia and the works of medieval Europe. He soon had an unexpected opportunity to do something about it. After the liberation of France, Lévi-Strauss returned to the United States as cultural counselor at the French embassy. He recalled, I had the opportunity of acquiring for France a famous collection of Native American art, which is now in a museum on the west coast of the United States. In payment, the seller wanted a few Matisse and Picasso canvases instead of taxable dollars. But despite all my efforts, I failed to convince the officials responsible for France's artistic policy, who happened to be visiting New York at the time. In 1957, guided by Darnoncourt, Nelson Rockefeller set up a private museum of primitive art in a Beaux-Arts townhouse next door to his childhood home in Manhattan. According to the official brochure, this was going to be, quote, the only museum devoted entirely to the rich and dynamic native arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. So AO art again. And this AO art, the brochure said, is as important to our cultural heritage as the arts, the more advanced civilization of the Orient and the West. Next slide, please. Nelson's son, Michael Rockefeller, shared his father's passion for primitive art. Like Nelson, he was a risk taker, reckless on ski slopes, regularly ticketed by the police for speeding. In 1961, when he was 23 years old, student at Harvard, Michael joined an expedition to New Guinea organized by Harvard's Peabody Museum. Traveling between two offshore islands in a dugout canoe, he and a young Dutch anthropologist found themselves in difficulties. Michael decided to swim for land through shark-infested waters. He disappeared. Next slide, please. Rockefeller set up a memorial exhibition at MoMA, and on display were hundreds of Asmat carvings that Michael had collected. And then in 1968, Nelson's aide, Darnoncourt, was run down and killed by a drunk driver. Nelson then closed his Museum of Primitive Art and offered the collection to the Met. The Michael Rockefeller wing of the Met opened January 1982, showing artworks from sub-Saharan Africa, the Pacific Islands, and the Americas. One of the curators involved in the installation recalls that the Met wanted the galleries to look like the other galleries in the museum. And she says this immediately meant that installation techniques used in Museum of Natural History were out. No mannequins, no photo murals, no music. And by the way, no ethnography. There was very little in the way of contextual information. Now, the lead up to this new wing of primitive art in the Met generated a huge amount of publicity and spawned a surge of competitive exhibitions. So the Museum of Modern Art reacted very quickly. And in 1984, it put on an exhibition, a very influential exhibition, which was called Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinity of the Tribal and the Modern. The curator, William Rubin, more or less accepted Goldwater's thesis that what mattered was not the primitive, whatever that might be, but primitivism, which was a movement in modern art. So he writes in the program of the exhibition, we owe to the voyagers, colonials, and ethnologists the arrival of these objects in the West, but we owe primarily to the convictions of pioneer modern artists, their promotion from the rank of curiosities and artifacts to that of major art, indeed to the status of art at all. So let anthropologists worry about the context in which these African and Oceanian artifacts were made. I have quite different aims. I want to understand the primitive sculptures in terms of the Western context in which modern artists discovered them. The ethnologist's primary concern, he went on, the specific function and significance of each of these objects is irrelevant to my topic, except insofar as these facts might have been known to the modern artists in question. In 1988, Susan Mullen-Vogel set up the Center for African Art in a pair of converted townhouses on Manhattan's Upper East Side. And she created another extremely influential exhibition, Art Artifact. Can I have the next slide, please? African Art in Anthropology Collections. This landmark exhibition confronted a nagging old problem. As Vogel wrote in her program, virtually all African artworks we know of were once qualified, categorized as artifacts. And the problem of distinguishing between the two categories has proven remarkably resistant to clear-cut solutions. They continue to bedevil those who collect and exhibit African and other primitive arts. But she took the view that, or she argued, that the difference between art and artifacts is no longer as clear-cut and as salient as it once was, because art historians and anthropologists have moved on. Anthropologists are more aware now of aesthetic issues, and art historians increasingly concerned with the broader context of artistic controversy, activity. In consequence, she said, installations in art and in ethnographic museums now resemble each other. And in fact, of course, there is this tendency of them all to be in a similar, elegant, minimalist art gallery kind of style. But difficult choices still have to be made. So have a look at the cover of this catalog. The bronze head top is, of course, Brancusi's Sleeping Muse, dated from 1910, which is just at the moment of the primitivist movement taking off in France. But the object below is an Azandi hunting net. Is the hunting net of the Zandi of the Sudan a work of art? Vogel showed the net to her mentor, Arthur Danto, who was a philosopher of aesthetics at Columbia University. Did he consider the hunting net to be a work of art or an artifact? Danto wrote in his contribution to the exhibition catalogue, it is in one sense a matter for experts to decide. But then again, perhaps not. Because of their striking resemblances, he said, even a highly trained anthropologist is incapable of distinguishing between an artwork and an artifact from the region. Now, whether art or artifact, this particular net had actually languished in the storeroom of the American Museum of Natural History, never exhibited for a century. When it was retrieved by Enid Schildkraut, curator of the African collection, and loaned to the Center of African Art for this exhibition, the net was still tied together as it is in this photograph, with a rope that was wound around it by the original collector, Herbert Lang, a photographer with the American Museum Congo expedition in 1914. But Susan Vogel decided to exhibit it just as Lang had prepared it for transport and storage, tied in a bundle. So if it is a work of art, should it be credited to the person who wove the net, or to the American collector who tied it in a bundle and made something new of it, or to the curator, Susan Vogel, who put it on show? Alfred Gell, who was a specialist in anthropology of art, praised Susan Vogel for making what is considered a breakthrough as a curator. And he called this Vogel's net, and compared Vogel's net to Duchamp's urinal. But Danto wasn't satisfied, Arthur Danto, the philosopher, wasn't really satisfied with this kind of trickery. He wanted a universal set of standards to decide what qualified as art. And in his essay, he invoked Socrates, Hegel, Wittgenstein, and he concludes there is no such thing as primitive art. He says, I quote, "The fact that African artifacts should have come through the restless drives of Western art to resemble artworks of considerable sophistication no more makes these artifacts into works of art than it confers on them that sophistication. When it comes to knives or nets or hairpins, the object's meaning is exhausted in their utility," he said. They are what they are used for. But artworks have a higher role, putting us in touch with higher realities. They are defined through the possession of meaning. They are explained through what they express. Now, this pompous sort of stuff was probably the last moment when the high priests of art felt free to adjudicate which non-European carvings, bronzes, ceramics, fabrics, totems, cult objects, decorative furnishings might be labeled works of art. By the early 21st century, even posing the question, what is art? Is it art? Had become a sure sign of Philistinism. You all know what the Turner Prize is. It's the main English prize for contemporary art. In the run-up to the 2004 Turner Prize, 500 experts were asked to name the most influential work of modern art. In place number 3 was Andy Warhol's 1962 silkscreen painting of Marilyn Monroe. In second place was Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon of 1907. And in first place, can any of you guess? First place was Marcel Duchamp's urinal fountain, first put on display in 1917. And the old dichotomy between authentic primitive art and tourist art was also crumbling. In 1989, an ambitious exhibition, Magiciens de la Terre, at the Pompidou Center in Paris, which was set out in order to make the Paris Biennale more inclusive, gave equal space to contemporary Western and non-Western artists and featured tourist art and outright kitsch alongside what was considered fine art. It's interesting, if you look at this catalog for this exhibition today, how it was still haunted by elements of the old primitivist creed. So the curators favored ritualistic or mystical subject matter. And Western artists were clearly being selected for a supposed affinity with primitivism. Okay, so we're now in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. The museums in Paris are struggling to keep pace with New York although New York keeps looking over its shoulder back at Paris. But the dynamic of these two centers was very different. Museums in Manhattan were philanthropic foundations endowed by tycoons and their wives, and often by their widows. And in Paris, the great museums and monuments have always been the playthings of rulers, kings, emperors, presidents of the Republic. Jacques Chirac, who was president from 1995 to 2007, had been a collector of African art since doing his military service as an officer in Algeria. For his grand projet, he decided on a museum of what he called primitive art in it originally. This might seem a surprising choice. Previous presidents had built monuments to modernity, to civilization, to France. But Paris had been left behind by New York. What answer did it have to the Rockefeller wing of the Met? And besides, Chirac's thought was a matter of human rights here. Human rights was, of course, a French thing. Chirac claimed that his museum was intended as a tribute to the Enlightenment ideals of fraternity and equality. In his address at the opening of the Quai Branly Museum in June 2006, June 20th, 2006, in the presence of Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the UN, and Claude Lévi-Strauss, Chirac asserted, "There is no hierarchy among the arts, just as there is no hierarchy among people. Every people has a particular message to deliver to the world, which can enrich humanity and contribute its portion to beauty and to truth." Now, Chirac, like Rockefeller, had his own particular agent, dealer. And in his case, Chirac's case, it was Jacques Kershach, a rather shady dealer who was detained in prison in Gabon in 1965 for the illegal export of sacred reliquaries. But Chirac was completely in awe of Kershach. He described him as a global I quote, a global specialist in des arts premiers, probably, even certainly, the man who has seen the most of the most lovely things in the world, whose eye can distinguish almost within a millimeter the vulgar from the work of genius. Kershach himself invoked Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The chefs-d'œuvre of the whole world are born free and equal. In March 1990, he orchestrated a manifesto in the progressive newspaper Libération, demanding instantly the establishment of a new section of the Louvre to be devoted, he said, to objects issuing from Africa, America, Arctic, Asiatic, and Oceanian cultures. Among the signatories of this letter were some of the leading French anthropologists, but not Claude Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss said, "The Louvre Museum is not at all a universal museum. The role of the Louvre is to bring together all that has formed the traditions of France and the Western world." But in 2000, as his new project was taking form, President Chirac invited the Louvre to mount a temporary exhibit of primitive art. Kershach would loan 120 Asian, African, American, Oceanic masterpieces from his own inventory. Some curators objected that the Louvre was dedicated to the highest achievements of civilization. It was not the place for primitive crafts. And anyway, should a dealer really be invited to show his personal stock at the Louvre? But Chirac insisted, and he got his way. The exhibition was mounted in the interstitial, notionally temporary venue, the Pavillon des Sessions, and it's still there. Then Chirac announced that nothing less than a whole new museum would suffice. And this time, Claude Lévi-Strauss came out in favor of Chirac's project. He even approved Chirac's appropriation of the ethnographic collection of the Musée de l'Homme to stock his art museum. Writing in Le Monde in 1996, Lévi-Strauss observed, I quote, and this is really a crucial statement. Lévi-Strauss writes, "An ethnographic museum can no longer offer an authentic image of the life of societies that are very different from our own. With a few exceptions, which will not long continue, these societies are being progressively integrated in global politics and economics. When I look again at the objects that I collected in the field between 1935 and 1938, and this is also true of others, I know well that their interest has become either documentary or, and above all, aesthetic. In the former aspect, they belong in a laboratory. In the latter, in a grand museum of arts and civilization. This was a hugely significant concession, even a surrender to the art world. Now, in the old Musée de l'Homme, ethnologists had ruled. Benoit de Lestroux described it as a museum of anthropology created by a staff of art lovers. But the Quai Branly was to be run by graduates of the École du Louvre. Could I have the next slide, please? The ethnologists were largely restricted to the identification and authentication of artifacts. Emmanuel Devaux, a disciple of Claude Lévi-Strauss, was the scientific director of the Quai Branly Museum between 2001 and 2006. In an interview with Le Monde, he was asked about the difference between the new museum and the Musée de l'Homme. He responded that the Musée de l'Homme, established under the umbrella of the Museum of Natural History, had been conceived of as a museum of human evolution. It associated exotic ethnographic materials with the findings of prehistory, and more or less explicitly distinguished all of that from the productions of a modern European civilization. But the Quai Branly Museum, he said, in contrast, insists on cultural diversity. Okay, his interviewer said. So why, in that case, is European art absent from the new museum? Devaux falls back on a pragmatic excuse. Well, Europe is simply so richly documented and represented that its presence would overwhelm the rest. All right, the interviewer said, but why does the Quai Branly, as he says, privilege the aesthetic? Devaux gave two answers. First, he said, it has been accepted since the early 20th century that there is no progress in art. Emphasizing this theme, and that is the project of the Quai Branly, firmly establishes the equality of all societies. And he added, this approach has a significant moral benefit. Second, he said, I quote, art is a good entry point for the presentation of the diversity of cultures. The value of art is widely appreciated today in our own culture, and that is because art has become a substitute for the religious. It is sacralized. Well, the Berlin museum community, I think, is accustomed to comparisons with the Louvre and with the British Museum. But a more immediate point of reference for the Humboldt Forum has been Jacques Chirac's museum in Paris. Perhaps Berlin was made just a tiny bit jealous by the enormous publicity garnered by Chirac's glamorous museum. The Quai Branly, you remember, was stocked with these collections of two established Paris museums, the Musée de l'Homme and the Museum of African and Oceanic Art. The Humboldt Museum followed the same model. It took over the collections of Berlin's Ethnological Museum and, of course, the much smaller Museum of Asian Art. Well, everybody, I'm sure, in your department is familiar with the damning verdict of your colleague Fritz Kramer. Quote, the Humboldt Forum has a tragicomic birth defect. The intention was to display cosmopolitanism, to reflect globalization, to promote a dialogue of cultures, and the idea was to rely for this on ethnographic collections of all things. The intrinsic problem, the birth defect, he said, was that ethnological collections are made up of objects from small, marginalized societies without writing on the edges of past colonial empires. It had nothing to do with globalization and cosmopolitanism. So he concluded, to put it bluntly, in the Humboldt Forum, Australia would be represented by the boomerang, America by feather headdresses, an obvious absurdity. And so, he said, those responsible are now trying to extricate themselves from this dilemma. That is why, in my opinion, the ethnologists are being shut out. And meanwhile, New York is preparing to counter the new challenge from Paris and Berlin. In November 2018, the Metropolitan Museum announced that the Michael Rockefeller wing was to be completely rebuilt. The press release boasted, by ushering artistic traditions of 3/4 of the globe into the Met, the building of the Rockefeller wing helped define the Rockefeller Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, as an encyclopedic fine arts museum. So, is it the case that this long-running competition between the art world and the anthropologists has ended finally in a decisive victory for the big battalions? And if so, by the way, what might be the future of the great ethnographic collections in Europe and North America? Collections that date back to the voyages of the Spanish and Portuguese explorers 5 centuries ago. One thing is certain, we have to start a radical rethink of what we intend for the future of ethnographic museums. And this must happen soon. Thank you very much.